What would you do if you were stopped by the police for absolutely no reason? For Marcus Johnson, a decorated black soldier, this wasn't just a random encounter. It became a moment that would change everything. When two officers wrongfully arrest him, they believe he's just another suspect. But when Marcus's true identity is revealed, it doesn't just shock the officers. It leaves the entire department scrambling to explain their actions. And just when they think they've seen it all, Marcus hands over a note that turns the situation upside down. Stick around to the end of this story to see how one man's resilience and courage sparked a movement for change. But before we dive into the story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe. It really helps us bring you more powerful stories like this. It was a bright, bustling morning in the heart of the city. The kind of morning where everything seemed to hum with energy. The steady rhythm of footsteps on the sidewalks, the distant buzz of traffic, and the occasional bark of a dog accompanying its owner. The city felt alive. Among the crowd, a figure stood out: Marcus Johnson. In his neatly pressed military uniform, he walked with purpose and confidence. Marcus had just left a local community event where he had been the keynote speaker, sharing stories of service and perseverance. His presence was commanding, not because he sought attention, but because his aura spoke volumes, a quiet strength, an unwavering calm. Marcus made his way down the street, stopping at a coffee shop he frequented. The barista behind the counter greeted him warmly. Barista, smiling. "Good morning, Sergeant Johnson. Your usual?" Marcus nodded, his lips curling into a small smile. "Marcus, you know me too well, Jess." As they chatted briefly, the barista handed him a steaming cup of coffee and a bag with a freshly made croissant. Marcus thanked her and turned to leave, pausing briefly to hold the door open for an elderly woman entering the shop. Marcus continued down the block, sipping his coffee. His sleek black sedan was parked just a few feet away. He set the bag of coffee and food on the roof of the car as he reached into his pocket for his keys. Unbeknownst to him, two police officers, Officer Carter and Officer Hale, had been watching him from across the street. "What do you think he's doing here, Carter? Doesn't look like he belongs, does he?" Carter smirked, nodding slightly. "Officer Carter, that car's way too nice. Let's see what he's up to." The two officers crossed the street, their demeanor rigid and their gazes locked on Marcus. Hale rested his hand casually near his holster, a gesture that spoke volumes about his mindset. Marcus noticed them approaching. He stayed calm, putting his coffee cup on the hood of the car as they got closer. "Excuse me, sir, can we talk to you for a minute?" Marcus turned, his posture straight and his expression polite. "Of course, officer. Is there something I can help you with?" Hale glanced at Carter, a subtle smirk tugging at his lips. "Officer Hale, what are you doing in this neighborhood?" "Just heading to my car after grabbing some coffee." Officer Carter, "Mind showing us some ID?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, his voice calm but firm. "May I ask why you're asking for my ID? Have I done something wrong?" Carter's tone grew sharper. Officer Carter, "Just show us your ID, sir. It's a simple request." Marcus nodded, slowly reaching into his pocket to retrieve his wallet. "All right, officer, here you go." As Carter took the ID, Hale walked around Marcus's car, peering through the windows. Officer Hale, mocking tone, "Nice ride. What do you do for work?" Marcus remained composed. Marcus, "I'm a soldier. Just got back from an event downtown." Hale's smirk faded for a moment, but he quickly masked it. Officer Hale, "A soldier, huh? Got anything illegal in that car of yours?" Marcus took a steady breath, keeping his hands visible. Marcus: "No, sir, you're welcome to search it, but I assure you there's nothing illegal inside." Carter handed back Marcus's ID, his expression hardening. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area, and you match the description." Marcus's stomach tightened, but his voice remained calm. "I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. I was just getting coffee and heading home." The officers exchanged a look, and Hale's hand inched closer to his holster. "Step away from the car, sir. We're going to need to detain you for questioning." Marcus froze, his heart pounding. He could feel the eyes of passers-by on him, some stopping to watch the scene unfold. Marcus, calm but firm: "Officers, I haven't done anything wrong. I've cooperated fully. Is there a reason for this?" Carter stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. "Officer Carter, step away from the car, now." Marcus slowly raised his hands, stepping back from the vehicle. The scene was tense, the air thick with unease. As Carter reached for his cuffs, Marcus looked at him steadily. "You don't know what you're doing." And with that, the officers moved in to detain him, setting the stage for a chain of events that none of them could have anticipated. The situation escalated quickly as Officer Carter and Officer Hale closed in on Marcus, cuffing his wrists tightly behind his back. Marcus winced slightly but maintained his calm demeanor, refusing to let the officers see any sign of distress. Around them, the bustling city morning came to a halt as onlookers began to gather. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the growing crowd. People paused their errands, their coffees forgotten, their dogs stilled at their sides. "What are you doing to him?" a woman's voice called out from across the street. It was Chloe Rivera, a young activist with a keen eye for injustice. She held up her phone, angling it to capture the scene. "He didn't do anything. Why are you arresting him?" Carter glanced at her with a dismissive sneer. "Step back, ma'am. This doesn't concern you." But Chloe was undeterred. "It concerns everyone when an innocent man is being harassed. He's not resisting. Look at him." Marcus, still calm, turned his head slightly toward the crowd. His voice was steady but firm. "It's all right. Stay calm. Let them do what they need to do." His composure seemed to agitate the officers further. Hale tightened his grip on Marcus's arm, jerking him toward the squad car. "Keep quiet." Hale muttered through gritted teeth. The crowd wasn't having it. More voices joined Chloe's, questioning the officer's actions. "What did he do?" an elderly man shouted. "This is wrong," a young woman added. Chloe zoomed in with her phone, making sure to capture every detail. "You're on camera," she called out to the officers. "The world is going to see this." Carter spun around, his frustration evident. "I said step back. Everyone, clear the area." He waved an arm toward the crowd, but no one moved. Despite the tension, Marcus remained unshaken. "Please," he said, his voice cutting through the rising noise. "Don't make this harder. Let them do their job, and everything will come to light." It was a remarkable display of restraint and authority, and it only deepened the crowd's respect for him. Chloe, her phone still recording, lowered her voice and said to the person next to her, "He's handling this better than they are." As the officers moved Marcus toward the car, Carter stopped abruptly and began patting him down. His hands roamed roughly over Marcus's uniform, pulling at pockets and tugging at his jacket. Marcus allowed it without a word, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance, as though he were miles away from the humiliation he was enduring. "Nothing," Carter muttered after a thorough check. "You're wasting everyone's time," someone in the crowd shouted. "Just doing our job," Hale shot back, though even he seemed less certain now. Marcus was gently maneuvering a small notebook from the inner pocket of his jacket. With subtle precision, he slipped it into his sock while Carter's attention was elsewhere. The motion was so fluid that it went unnoticed by the officers, but it wasn't lost on Chloe, who caught the movement with her camera. She whispered, "Smart move," to herself, wondering what Marcus was up to. Finally, the officers reached the squad car. Carter opened the back door with a rough tug and gestured for Marcus to get in. "Watch your head," he said, though his tone carried no genuine concern. Marcus stepped into the car, carefully maneuvering his long legs to avoid the doorframe. Once seated, he turned to look at the crowd. His expression was calm but firm, a quiet storm of unspoken words. He raised his voice just enough to be heard through the car window. "Thank you all for standing up," he said. "Stay strong. The truth always comes out." The crowd erupted into murmurs of support, some shouting their encouragement, others continuing to question the officers' motives. Chloe kept her phone trained on the scene until the door slammed shut, cutting off their view of Marcus. Inside the car, Marcus settled into the hard, uncomfortable seat. The thick barrier separating him from the front officers felt oppressive, but he focused his mind. He had been in situations far more dangerous than this. Situations where the stakes were higher, where lives depended on his decisions. This was different, but the principles of remaining composed and calculating were the same. As the car began to pull away, Marcus leaned his head back and closed his eyes briefly. In his mind, he could hear the voice of his commanding officer, echoing advice from years ago. "Stay sharp, stay in control, and always stay one step ahead." He opened his eyes and glanced down at his foot. The notebook was secure in his sock, its corner pressing lightly against his ankle. It wasn't just a notebook. It held something far more significant, something that could turn the tide in his favor. The car wound through the city streets, the distant sounds of the crowd fading into the hum of tires on asphalt. Carter and Hale didn't speak, though their rigid postures hinted at unease. Hale, who had been so confident earlier, kept glancing at the rearview mirror, catching glimpses of Marcus's composed expression. "What are you smirking at?" Hale finally snapped, though Marcus wasn't smirking at all. Marcus met Hale's gaze in the mirror, his voice calm but cutting. "You'll find out soon enough." Carter grunted, clearly unimpressed, but said nothing. The silence in the car grew heavier with each passing minute, broken only by the occasional crackle of the police radio. As they approached the station, Marcus straightened his posture. He took a deep breath, preparing himself for what was to come. His reflection in the window stared back at him, resolute and unwavering. The squad car rolled into the station's garage, the faint hum of fluorescent lights replacing the city's noise. Carter killed the engine and turned to look at Marcus through the barrier. "You've got a lot of nerve," Carter said, shaking his head. Marcus didn't flinch. His voice was calm, deliberate. "This will be a day you won't forget." The officers exchanged a glance, their unease palpable now. As Carter opened the door and reached for Marcus's arm, Marcus stepped out willingly, his movements precise and controlled. The moment they entered the station, the atmosphere shifted. Officers glanced up from their desks, their expressions a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Marcus's presence in his uniform seemed to strike a discordant note with their assumptions, but no one said anything. Marcus was led toward the processing, but his mind was already at work. He knew the truth was on his side, and he intended to wield it like a weapon. For now, he stayed quiet, his notebook hidden, his resolve unbroken. The game had just begun. The police station was a whirlwind of activity, a place where tension seemed to seep into the very walls. Phones rang incessantly, Officers moved briskly through the corridors with stacks of paperwork or cups of steaming coffee, and the hum of voices filled the air. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a harsh glow over the scene. It was the kind of environment where urgency reigned supreme, and everyone seemed too busy to notice the subtle undercurrents of unease that occasionally bubbled to the surface. Carter and Hale marched Marcus through the front doors, their expressions carefully neutral but betraying hints of discomfort. A few officers glanced up from their desks as the trio entered, their eyes briefly scanning Marcus's uniform before shifting to the two arresting officers. "Another one?" muttered an officer near the front desk, barely looking up from his computer. "Looks like it," someone else replied, their tone indifferent. Marcus, his hands cuffed behind his back, walked with the same steady composure he had shown during his arrest. His military uniform, though slightly rumpled from the scuffle, still bore the insignia of his rank and the ribbons of his service. He caught a few sideways glances from the officers in the room but said nothing, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the chaos around him. "Over here," Carter barked, steering Marcus toward the processing area. Hale followed closely behind, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Despite his earlier bravado, something about Marcus's calm, unshaken presence was starting to gnaw at him. The processing desk was manned by a bored-looking officer who barely glanced up as Carter pushed Marcus forward. "Name?" the officer asked, his fingers poised over the keyboard. "Marcus Johnson," Carter answered before Marcus could speak. The officer typed the name into the system and frowned slightly as he scanned the screen. "Doesn't seem to be anything here. What's the charge?" "Suspicious activity," Hale interjected quickly, his voice a touch defensive, "and resisting arrest." The officer raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. Instead, he gestured toward the fingerprinting station. "All right, let's get this over with." Marcus was led to the fingerprinting area, where Hale took the lead. As he guided Marcus's hands onto the scanner, he couldn't resist making a snide remark. "Nice insignia," Hale said with a smirk, nodding toward the badge on Marcus's chest. "Guessing you found that in a thrift store?" Marcus didn't react. He held Hale's gaze for a moment, his expression unreadable, before turning his attention back to the scanner. "You'd be surprised," Marcus said simply, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made Hale's smirk falter. The interaction didn't go unnoticed. Carter, standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't sure what it was, but something about the situation felt off. He glanced at Marcus's uniform again, his eyes lingering on the insignia and the polished boots. "You sure about this, Hale?" Carter muttered under his breath as they finished the fingerprinting process. Hale shot him a look. "Don't start, Carter." He matched the description. "We're just doing our job." Carter didn't respond, but the seed of doubt had been planted. As they led Marcus toward a holding cell, the air in the station seemed to shift. Officers who had barely paid attention earlier were now watching more closely. Whispers began to circulate, low murmurs passing from desk to desk. That was when Lieutenant Sarah Blake entered the room. Blake was known throughout the department as a no-nonsense leader who demanded excellence and had no patience for incompetence. She was tall, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through a person. Her presence commanded respect, and the room seemed to quiet slightly as she walked in. She spotted Carter and Hale immediately, her gaze narrowing as she took in the scene. Her eyes shifted to Marcus, noting his uniform and his calm demeanor. Something about the situation didn't sit right with her. "Carter?" she called out, her voice firm and authoritative. Carter stiffened and turned to face her. "Yes, Lieutenant?" "What's going on here?" Blake asked, crossing her arms as she approached. Her eyes flicked to Marcus, then back to Carter. "Just processing a suspect, ma'am," Carter replied, his tone carefully neutral. Blake raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "What's the charge?" Hale stepped in, his voice eager to defend their actions. "Suspicious activity and resisting arrest." He matched a description we received from a report. Blake's gaze shifted to Marcus, who met her eyes with quiet confidence. She took a moment to assess him, noting his polished appearance and the way he carried himself. "Matched a description, huh?" Blake said, her tone skeptical. "And what exactly was that description?" Carter hesitated, glancing at Hale, who avoided his gaze. Male, late 30s, African American, well-dressed." Blake's lips pressed into a thin line. "So, you're telling me you arrested this man based on that vague description?" Hale bristled. He was acting suspiciously. "Enough," Blake snapped, cutting him off. Her eyes narrowed as she focused on Carter. "Did he resist?" Carter hesitated again, then shook his head. "No, ma'am, not exactly." Blake took a step closer, her voice lowering. "Not exactly? Either he resisted or he didn't. Which is it?" Before Carter could stammer out a response, a junior officer approached cautiously. It was Officer Derek, a relatively new recruit who had been quietly observing the scene. He looked nervous but determined as he stepped closer to Blake. "Lieutenant," Derek said, his voice low but urgent. Blake turned to him, her expression softening slightly. "What is it, Derek?" I think I recognize this guy," Derek said, glancing at Marcus. "I saw him in a news article a while back. I'm not sure, but I think he's someone important." Blake's eyes narrowed as she processed Derek's words. She turned to Marcus, studying him more closely. Something in her gut told her that Derek was right. "Carter, Hale," Blake said sharply, her tone brooking no argument. "I want a full report on this arrest on my desk within the hour. And Derek, come with me. We're going to get to the bottom of this." As Blake led Derek toward her office, she couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was about to unravel in ways none of them could have anticipated. Lieutenant Sarah Blake wasted no time. The unease she felt after hearing Officer Derek's cautious recognition of Marcus Johnson lingered like a shadow, and her instincts told her there was more to this man than the surface revealed. In her office, she closed the door firmly and gestured for Derek to sit down. "All right," she said, her voice steady but curious. "Tell me everything you know." Derek shifted nervously in his seat, his eyes darting toward the closed blinds. I don't know much, Lieutenant. Just that I saw his name in an article a while back. Something about him being involved in high-profile cases. I think he's a decorated Army Ranger, too." Blake's brows furrowed. She pulled her laptop closer, typing Marcus Johnson's name into the search bar. As the results loaded, her eyes scanned the page, and her unease deepened. Article after article confirmed what Derek had said, and more. Marcus wasn't just a soldier, he was a hero. A recipient of numerous commendations, including the Bronze Star, Marcus had served with distinction overseas. Upon returning home, he had used his platform to become a civil rights advocate, working tirelessly to expose corruption in government and law enforcement. Blake leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "Well," she said, her tone dry, "this just became a lot more complicated." "What do we do, ma'am?" Derek asked hesitantly. Blake didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood, her hands on her hips as she stared at the screen. "First, we get the full story," she said finally. "Then we figure out how much of a mess Carter and Hale just created." Meanwhile, Marcus sat quietly in the holding cell, His posture relaxed despite the confines of the space. The narrow bench beneath him was uncomfortable, and the faint smell of bleach mixed with something sour lingered in the air. But Marcus had endured far worse in his life. He wasn't going to let this moment break him. The cell wasn't empty. 2 other detainees shared the space, each casting curious glances at Marcus. One of them, a wiry man with a face hardened by years of struggle, finally spoke up. "You're that guy, aren't you?" he said, his voice rough but tinged with respect. "The one who took down that corrupt sheriff last year." Marcus turned to him, his expression calm but slightly curious. "And what makes you think that?" he asked. The man shrugged. "Saw you on the news. They said you were an Army Ranger, fought overseas, and now you're fighting for people here. You got guts." The other detainee, a younger man in his 20s, leaned forward. "Wait, that's you? No way, they locked you up?" Marcus nodded slightly but didn't elaborate. He wasn't here to explain himself. Instead, he looked down at his hands, the faint indentations from the handcuffs still visible on his wrists. He took a deep breath, then began to speak, his voice low but steady. "This isn't new," he said, addressing no one in particular. "I've served my country, stood shoulder to shoulder with men and women from every background you can imagine. We fought for each other, for the ideals we were told made this country great. But here back home, it doesn't always feel like the fight is over." The cell grew quiet as Marcus continued. "I've seen how people like us are treated, judged by the color of our skin before we even open our mouths. And it doesn't matter what you've done or who you are. Some people will always see you as a threat." The wiry man nodded solemnly. "Ain't that the truth?" "But that doesn't mean you stop fighting," Marcus said firmly. "You keep pushing. You hold people accountable. You remind them that justice isn't just a word, it's an action, a promise." The younger man looked at Marcus with wide eyes, a flicker of hope sparking in his expression. "Man, you should be out there, not in here." Marcus gave a small smile, then leaned back against the cold wall. "We'll see about that." As the conversation faded, Marcus subtly reached down to his sock, pulling out the small notebook he had hidden earlier. Flipping to a blank page, he began to write, his pen moving swiftly but carefully. He knew this note could be crucial, a calculated move in the chess game unfolding around him. Once he finished, he folded the paper neatly and tucked it into his pocket. In her office, Blake reviewed Carter and Hale's reports, her frustration mounting with every passing moment. The statements were vague, riddled with half-truths and flimsy justifications. She slammed the file shut and stormed out, finding the 2 officers chatting casually near the break room. "Carter! Hale!" she barked, her voice slicing through the hum of conversation. The 2 men snapped to attention, their expressions wary. "My office. Now." They followed her, exchanging uneasy glances. Once inside, Blake closed the door and fixed them with a glare that could cut steel. "Care to explain why you arrested a decorated Army Ranger and civil rights advocate with no concrete evidence?" she demanded. Carter hesitated, his bravado from earlier now replaced with uncertainty. "Lieutenant, we had a report." He matched the description. "Stop," Blake interrupted, holding up a hand. "Do you know how many people match the description you just gave me? Black, male, well-dressed? That's not probable cause, Carter, that's profiling." Hale tried to step in. "Look, Lieutenant, we thought—" "No," Blake snapped, her tone icy. "You didn't think. You saw a black man in a nice car and assumed he didn't belong. And now, we're in the middle of a PR disaster waiting to happen." Carter opened his mouth to argue, but quickly closed it when Blake's glare intensified. "Here's what's going to happen," she continued. You're both going to rewrite these reports with the actual truth, and then you're going to pray this doesn't blow up in your faces." Before they could respond, there was a knock at the door. Derek poked his head in, his expression tense. "Lieutenant, I found something else." Blake's stomach tightened. "What is it?" "It's bigger than we thought," Derek said, stepping inside and lowering his voice. "I just got off the phone with a contact in the Federal Bureau. Marcus Johnson is connected to an ongoing investigation into police misconduct, a federal investigation." Blake's eyes widened. "You're sure?" Derek nodded. "They've been gathering evidence for months. Johnson's been working with them, uncovering corruption, misconduct, even ties to organized crime." Blake leaned against her desk, her mind racing. She turned to Carter and Hale, who now looked visibly pale. "Do you two have any idea what you've done?" she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You didn't just arrest the wrong guy. You just jeopardized a federal operation." The weight of her words hung heavy in the room. Carter stammered, his face drained of color. "We didn't know." Blake shook her head, her frustration boiling over. "That's the problem. You didn't know, and you didn't bother to find out. Now we're all in the crosshairs." She turned back to Derek. "Get me everything you can on this investigation. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with." As Derek nodded and left the room, Blake exhaled sharply, trying to steady herself. This wasn't just a mess, it was a potential catastrophe, and somehow she had to figure out how to clean it up. Back in the holding cell, Marcus remained calm, his note securely tucked away. He knew the wheels were turning outside, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down. Word of Marcus Johnson's arrest spread like wildfire. Chloe Rivera, who had captured the arrest on her phone, wasted no time uploading the video to her social media accounts. Her caption read, "A decorated black soldier is wrongfully arrested in broad daylight for matching a description. This has to stop." Within minutes, the video began to gain traction. Comments poured in, sharing disbelief, anger, and calls for action. By the time Chloe arrived outside the police station, a small group of protesters had already begun to gather. Among them were local community leaders and activists, many of whom recognized Marcus from his work as a civil rights advocate. They carried hastily made signs reading "Justice for Marcus" and "End Police Profiling." Their chants echoed through the streets, drawing more attention as passers-by stopped to join the growing crowd. Chloe stood at the front, her phone still in hand, live streaming the scene. "We're here, outside the station, where Marcus Johnson, a decorated soldier and community leader, is being held," she said, her voice firm but emotional. "This isn't just about one man. It's about all of us. It's about justice." The crowd cheered in agreement, their voices growing louder as more people arrived. The energy was electric, a mix of anger and determination. Local news outlets soon picked up the story, and within hours, cameras and reporters lined the sidewalks, broadcasting the protest to an even larger audience. The pressure on the police department was mounting, and inside, the tension was palpable. Lieutenant Sarah Blake watched the chaos unfolding from her office window. She could hear the chants even through the thick glass, the words cutting through the air like a blade. "Justice for Marcus." She had seen protests like this before, but something about this one felt different. The crowd was growing by the minute, and the media presence ensured that this wasn't going away quietly. Blake turned away from the window, her mind racing. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. She made her way to the holding area, where Marcus sat calmly in his cell, his posture relaxed despite the commotion outside. He looked up as she approached, his gaze steady and unreadable. "Mr. Johnson," Blake said, her tone measured, "we need to talk." Marcus stood, his movements deliberate and composed. "By all means, Lieutenant," he replied, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. Blake unlocked the cell door and gestured for Marcus to follow her. She led him to an interrogation room, where she motioned for him to sit. She took the seat across from him, placing a file on the table between them. "I've been looking into your background," Blake began. "Decorated Army Ranger, civil rights advocate, and now, apparently a suspect in suspicious activity. Care to explain?" Marcus leaned back slightly, his expression unchanging. "I think you already know the answer to that, Lieutenant." Blake's eyes narrowed. "Let's not play games here. You were carrying out some kind of investigation, weren't you?" Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and retrieved the folded note he had written earlier. He placed it on the table, his hand resting on it briefly before sliding it toward her. "This," he said, his voice steady, "contains everything you need to know." Blake hesitated before picking up the note. Her instincts screamed that whatever was written inside could either save the department or destroy it. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the contents. As she read, her expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief and finally to realization. "This," she began, her voice trailing off, "this is evidence," Marcus finished for her. "Evidence of systemic issues that your department has either ignored or enabled. And before you ask how I got it, let's just say I've been keeping a close eye on things for a while." Blake's mind raced. The note detailed specific instances of misconduct, complete with names, dates, and actions. It was damning. She looked up at Marcus, who met her gaze with unwavering confidence. "You realize what this means, don't you?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "It means you have a choice to make. You can either do the right thing, or you can keep covering for people who don't deserve to wear the badge." Before Blake could respond, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen and felt her stomach tighten. The caller ID read, "Federal Agent Nathan Collins." She shot Marcus a sharp look. "Is this your doing?" Marcus gave a faint smile. "I told you, Lieutenant, the truth always comes out." Blake answered the call, her voice steady despite the unease creeping into her chest. "Lieutenant Blake speaking." "Lieutenant," Agent Collins said, his tone curt and professional. "This is Agent Nathan Collins with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I believe you're currently holding Marcus Johnson." "Yes," Blake replied cautiously. "What's this about?" "I'm calling to inform you that Mr. Johnson is a key asset in an ongoing federal investigation into police misconduct," Collins said. "His arrest jeopardizes months of work and puts him at risk." Blake felt a chill run down her spine. "I wasn't aware of this, Agent Collins." "Well, now you are," Collins replied sharply. "I trust you'll handle this appropriately. And let me be clear, any further action against Mr. Johnson will be met with severe consequences." The line went dead before Blake could respond. She set the phone down slowly, her mind racing. She looked back at Marcus, who sat calmly, as though he hadn't just been at the center of a federal investigation. "You've been busy," Blake said, her tone dry. Marcus gave a small shrug. "I do what needs to be done." Blake exhaled sharply, leaning back in her chair. The weight of the situation was pressing down on her, and she knew there was no easy way out. The department was in deep trouble, and Marcus held all the cards. Outside, the chants grew louder, the crowd demanding justice. Blake knew the storm was far from over. "All right, Mr. Johnson," she said finally. "You've made your point. Now let's see if we can fix this mess." But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. Lieutenant Sarah Blake stormed into the station's break room, where Officers Carter and Hale were seated. The two men had the air of employees on edge, their conversation halting as soon as they saw her approaching. Blake's face was a storm cloud of frustration, and her sharp gaze pinned them both in place. "Carter! Hale!" she barked, her voice slicing through the quiet hum of the room. "My office! Now!" The officers exchanged uneasy glances, but neither dared to argue. They followed her out of the break room and down the hallway, their footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. Inside her office, Blake shut the door firmly and leaned against her desk, her arms crossed. Her expression was unreadable, but the tension in the air was suffocating. "Sit," she ordered, motioning to the chairs in front of her desk. The two officers sat, their discomfort palpable. Carter tried to appear nonchalant, but his nervous glances toward Hale betrayed him. Hale, on the other hand, looked as though he wanted to be anywhere else. "Do you two have any idea what kind of disaster you've created?" Blake began, her voice low and controlled, though the anger simmering beneath the surface was evident. "Do you understand who Marcus Johnson is?" Carter opened his mouth to speak, but Blake cut him off with a raised hand. "No, don't answer that. Because if you'd done your due diligence, you'd already know the answer. He's not just some random guy you can target without consequences. He's a decorated Army Ranger, a civil rights advocate. And, if you can believe this, he's part of a federal investigation." The last sentence landed like a bombshell. Carter's face went pale, and Hale shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Federal investigation?" Hale repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's right," Blake snapped. "You didn't just arrest the wrong guy. You jeopardized a months-long operation. And now, thanks to your complete lack of judgment, we're all in deep trouble." Carter cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Lieutenant, we were just doing our job." He matched the description. "Stop," Blake interrupted, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Matched the description? Do you hear yourself? Your description was so vague it could have applied to half the men in this city. You didn't arrest him because of a description. You arrested him because of your biases." Hale flinched, his gaze dropping to his lap. "We didn't mean to." "To what?" Blake snapped, her voice rising. "To embarrass this department? To put us on the front page of every news outlet in the country? To spark protests outside this station? What exactly didn't you mean to do?" The silence that followed was deafening. Both men avoided her gaze, their earlier bravado completely stripped away. "You're going to write detailed reports explaining every step of your actions," Blake said finally, her voice cold. "And you're going to pray that's enough to minimize the damage. But make no mistake, this will not end here." Before either of them could respond, a knock on the door interrupted the tense standoff. Blake turned, and Officer Derrick stepped inside, looking as though he'd rather be anywhere else. "Lieutenant," he said hesitantly, "Agent Collins is here. He wants to speak with you." Blake's stomach twisted. "Of course he does," she muttered under her breath. "Send him to the conference room. I'll be right there." Derrick nodded and disappeared, leaving Blake alone with Carter and Hale. She turned back to them, her eyes narrowing. "Get out," she said, "and start writing those reports." The two officers scrambled to their feet and hurried out of the office, neither daring to look back. Blake exhaled slowly, steeling herself before heading to the conference room. Agent Nathan Collins was already seated when Blake entered. His suit was immaculate, his expression severe. He exuded an air of authority that made the already tense atmosphere in the room even heavier. "Lieutenant Blake," he said curtly, standing to shake her hand, "thank you for meeting with me." Blake nodded, taking a seat across from him. "Agent Collins, I assume you're here about Marcus Johnson." "You assume correctly," Collins replied. His tone was professional, but carried an edge that made it clear he wasn't in the mood for excuses. "Mr. Johnson's arrest has put a significant operation at risk. Do you understand the gravity of the situation?" Blake nodded again, though her heart sank at the implication. "I do, and I take full responsibility for my officer's actions." Collins raised an eyebrow. "Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like your department has a systemic problem." Blake stiffened but didn't argue. "We're taking steps to address that." "You'd better be," Collins said sharply, "because if you're not, the federal government will." He leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "I'm here to ensure that Mr. Johnson is released immediately. Anything less, and we'll consider this an act of obstruction." Blake hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "He'll be released within the hour." "Good," Collins said, standing. "And Lieutenant, let me be clear. This is far from over. Your department is under a microscope now. One more misstep, and there will be consequences." With that, he turned and left, leaving Blake to process the full weight of his words. Back in the holding area, Marcus waited patiently, his calm demeanor unchanged. He looked up as Blake approached, a set of keys in her hand. "You're free to go," she said, unlocking the cell door. Marcus stepped out, his movements measured and deliberate. He didn't say anything at first, simply studying Blake with the same calm intensity he had displayed since the moment he was arrested. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. Blake nodded, though the guilt gnawed at her. "For what it's worth, Mr. Johnson, I'm sorry. This shouldn't have happened." Marcus gave her a faint smile. "You're right, it shouldn't have." As he prepared to leave, Marcus reached into his pocket and retrieved the folded note. He handed it to Blake, his expression serious. "You'll want to read this." Blake hesitated before taking it. She unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the contents. With every line she read, her expression shifted from curiosity to shock. The note detailed findings from Marcus's undercover investigation. Instances of corruption, abuse of power, and systemic discrimination within the department. It was damning, and it was clear that Marcus had been gathering this evidence for months, if not longer. At the bottom of the note, one line stood out. "This is only the beginning." Blake looked up at Marcus, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you going to do?" Marcus smiled faintly, his calm confidence unwavering. "What I always do, Lieutenant. Fight for what's right." With that, he turned and walked out of the station, the sounds of the protest outside growing louder as the door swung open. Blake stood frozen, the weight of the note heavy in her hand. She knew this wasn't just a wake-up call. It was the start of a reckoning. The fallout from Marcus Johnson's arrest was immediate and overwhelming. The video of his detainment, paired with his distinguished identity as an Army Ranger and civil rights advocate, spread like wildfire across social media and major news outlets. By the time night fell, the protest outside the police station had swelled into the hundreds, with more people arriving by the hour. Activists carried signs demanding justice, their voices raised in chants that echoed down the streets. Justice for Marcus. End police profiling. Accountability now. The media presence had multiplied, with reporters jostling for space to capture the growing unrest. The arrest had struck a nerve not just in the city, but across the country, sparking discussions about systemic racism and misuse of power. News anchors dissected the incident, showing clips of Marcus's calm composure juxtaposed against the officer's aggressive behavior. The revelation of Marcus's identity only added fuel to the fire. As his military record and his history of fighting corruption became public knowledge, the narrative shifted from outrage to fury. The crowd's demands grew louder and more specific. "We want Carter and Hale suspended," shouted one activist into a megaphone. "No more excuses, no more injustice." Community leaders and prominent activists began arriving, lending their voices to the cause. Chloe Rivera, whose video had been the catalyst for the movement, stood at the forefront, holding a microphone as she addressed the crowd. "We are here tonight because enough is enough," Chloe said, her voice strong and steady. "Marcus Johnson isn't just a victim of profiling. He's a hero, and yet he was treated like a criminal because of the color of his skin. This has to stop, and it has to stop now." The crowd roared in agreement, their energy electric. Inside the police station, Lieutenant Sarah Blake sat in her office, the chants from outside echoing faintly through the walls. The weight of the situation pressed down on her like a physical force. She had spent the last several hours reviewing the damning evidence Marcus had provided in his note, her mind reeling at the extent of the corruption within her department. Blake knew she couldn't ignore what was happening outside. The demands for justice were growing louder, and the public wasn't going to accept anything less than decisive action. She picked up the phone and called the chief of police, her voice firm despite the tension. "We need to suspend Carter and Hale immediately," she said. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before the chief responded, his tone hesitant. "That's a big step, Sarah. Are you sure?" "Yes," Blake replied without hesitation. "If we don't act now, this department will lose what little credibility it has left." The chief sighed, but eventually agreed. Within the hour, Carter and Hale were informed of their suspension, effective immediately. Both officers reacted with shock and indignation, but their protests fell on deaf ears. Blake made it clear that their actions had consequences, and this was only the beginning. As the news of the suspension spread, the crowd outside erupted into cheers. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The following morning, Marcus Johnson stood at the center of the protest, surrounded by cameras and reporters. The energy of the crowd was palpable, their anticipation hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Marcus stepped forward, his posture commanding, his presence magnetic. He looked out over the sea of faces, his voice steady and powerful as he began to speak. "Thank you," he said, his words carrying across the crowd. "Thank you for standing with me, for standing with each other. This isn't just about me. This is about every person who has ever been judged not by their character but by their appearance. This is about justice for everyone." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the streets. Marcus waited for the noise to die down before continuing. "When I put on this uniform, I swore an oath to serve and protect. I fought overseas, not just for my country, but for the ideals we hold dear: freedom, equality, and justice. But what does it say about our country when someone who has served with honor can be treated like a criminal for simply existing?" The crowd murmured in agreement, their anger and frustration bubbling to the surface. "This isn't just a problem with one department or a few bad officers," Marcus said, his voice rising. "This is a systemic issue, and if we want real change, we have to address it at its roots. We need accountability, we need transparency, and we need reform." The crowd cheered again, their voices filled with hope and determination. Marcus paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces before him. "But let me be clear," he said, his tone firm. "This isn't just about pointing fingers. This is about building something better. It's about creating a system that works for everyone, a system that values every life equally." The crowd roared their approval, their chants of "Justice for Marcus" ringing through the air. Inside the station, Blake was already taking steps to address the issues Marcus had brought to light. She had ordered a comprehensive review of the department's practices, focusing on training programs, de-escalation techniques, and accountability measures. It was a daunting task, and she knew it wouldn't be enough to fix everything, but it was a start. Her decision to suspend Carter and Hale had drawn backlash from some of her colleagues, who accused her of caving to public pressure. Blake, however, was unfazed. She knew that standing on the right side of history meant making difficult decisions, even if it cost her the support of some within the department. "This isn't about protecting egos," she said during a tense meeting with senior officers. "It's about protecting the community we swore to serve. If we don't act now, we'll lose their trust forever." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. That evening, Marcus stood with Chloe and several community leaders discussing the next steps in their fight for justice. The protest had made an impact, but Marcus knew there was still a long road ahead. As they talked, a reporter approached, microphone in hand. "Mr. Johnson," she said, "what's next for you? Do you have a plan to address these issues on a larger scale?" Marcus smiled faintly, his eyes gleaming with determination. "This is only the beginning," he said. "We've started a conversation, but now it's time for action. We're working on a proposal to create independent oversight committees, provide better training for officers, and hold departments accountable for their actions. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts here. It starts with us." The reporter nodded, clearly impressed. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson. We'll be watching closely." As the reporter walked away, Marcus turned back to Chloe and the others. "We've got a lot of work to do," he said. "And we'll do it," Chloe replied firmly. "Together." The group stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their mission settling over them. But as Marcus looked out over the dispersing crowd, he felt a glimmer of hope. They were building something new, something better. And he wasn't going to stop until justice was more than just a word, it was a reality. The weeks that followed Marcus Johnson's arrest marked the beginning of a profound shift in the city. The protests had sparked not just outrage but a movement, and Marcus knew he had to harness that momentum to create lasting change. With the support of activists like Chloe Rivera and a growing network of community leaders, Marcus launched the Justice Through Unity initiative, a program designed to educate citizens about their rights and empower them to hold systems accountable. At the heart of the initiative were workshops held at community centers, schools, and places of worship. Marcus, often dressed in his army uniform, stood in front of packed rooms, his presence commanding and his words inspiring. "Knowing your rights is the first step to protecting them," he would say, his voice steady but passionate. "And protecting them is how we ensure justice for everyone, not just a privileged few." The workshops covered everything from how to handle encounters with law enforcement to filing complaints against misconduct. Marcus ensured the sessions were interactive, allowing people to share their experiences and ask questions. The impact was immediate and profound, with attendees walking away feeling not just informed but empowered. Chloe played a crucial role in spreading the word, using her social media platforms to highlight the initiative's success. The video of Marcus addressing a room full of young people, his words resonating deeply, went viral. "This is the change we've been fighting for," Chloe captioned the clip. Inside the police department, reform was finally taking root. Lieutenant Sarah Blake, despite facing resistance from some of her colleagues, led the charge. Under her leadership, the department implemented mandatory training programs focused on de-escalation techniques, cultural sensitivity, and implicit bias. An independent oversight committee, including members of the community, was established to review cases of misconduct and ensure accountability. Blake worked tirelessly, often putting in late hours to review policies and attend community forums. She knew change wouldn't come easily, but the progress they were making gave her hope. For the first time in her career, she felt like she was truly serving the people. However, not everyone within the department welcomed the changes. Officers Carter and Hale, suspended in the wake of their actions, became the focus of an internal investigation. The findings were damning. Not only had they wrongfully arrested Marcus, but there was evidence of a pattern of discriminatory behavior in their past cases. Public outrage over their actions grew louder with each revelation. News outlets covered their downfall extensively, detailing their misconduct and the consequences they now faced. Both officers were formally charged with civil rights violations, their badges stripped in a public display of accountability. Their faces became synonymous with the systemic issues Marcus had been fighting to expose. For Marcus, their downfall was not a moment of triumph but a reminder of the work that remained. "This isn't about two officers," he told a reporter during a press conference. "This is about a system that allowed their behavior to go unchecked for years. We've made progress, but there's still a long way to go." Months later, Marcus stood in a sunlit community center, addressing a group of young activists. The room buzzed with energy, the faces of the audience filled with hope and determination. Marcus walked to the front of the room, his movements measured, his presence commanding. "You're the future," he began, his voice calm but resonant. "And the future depends on what we do today." He paused, letting his words sink in. "There will be setbacks," he continued. "There will be moments when the fight feels impossible. But resilience is what carries us forward. Unity is what makes us unstoppable. Look around you. This is what change looks like. It starts with us, and it spreads." The young activists nodded, their resolve strengthening under Marcus's words. "When I was wrongfully arrested, I could have let anger consume me," Marcus said. "But anger alone doesn't bring change. Action does. And that's why we're here today. To take action. To build a future where justice isn't just a dream, but a reality." The room erupted into applause, the sound filling every corner. Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with pride. Later that evening, Marcus stood outside the community center, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Chloe joined him, a satisfied smile on her face. "We've come a long way," she said. Marcus nodded. "We have, but there's still so much more to do." Chloe raised an eyebrow. "What's next, then?" Marcus glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Something bigger," he said simply. She grinned. "Bigger, huh? I can't wait to see it." As the screen fades to black, Marcus's voice lingers, a final message to the audience. This is just the beginning. Change takes time, effort, and all of us working together. Stay strong, stay united, and never stop fighting for what's right. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that inspire action. And be sure to check out our next video, because if you thought this was impactful, you won't believe what's coming next. Click here to see how one person can ignite a revolution. Thank you for being part of this journey. Together, we can make a difference.